Hello, I'm Roger Citron, and I'm a associate dean and professor of law at Touro University, Jacob D. Fuchsberg College of Law. And this is the Touro Law Review podcast. And today our guest is Greg Zipes. He is the author of Justice and Faith, the Frank Murphy story. And we're going to talk today with Mr. Zipes about his book and about Justice Murphy. And to start us off, if I can call you Greg,
absolutely.
Please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write about Justice Murphy.
Sure. I am based in New York City. I'm a lawyer and I work for the government in New York City. I also teach at NYU. I teach a bankruptcy class at NYU School of Professional Studies, so a bunch of non-attorneys, but in the financial industry. And I have various interests. I grew up upstate New York. Different people have different definitions of upstate, but I grew up in Dutchess County, New York, which is about 60 miles north of New York City. And I was close to the FDR house and museum. When I was growing up, my parents took me there a lot. They had a lot of reverence for FDR. I often return to Dutchess County. I have friends up there and family members. And so I went to an exhibit at FDR, at the FDR Museum, and they were featuring the Japanese American internment. This was a dark time in American history. During World War II, Japanese Americans, through Executive Order 9066, FDR's order, were exiled from the West Coast and sent to interior camps, internment camps, concentration camps. There are different words for it, which maybe we can get into a little bit later. But I started to wonder, did anybody stand up to this at the time? This was during World War II, and rights were being trampled in the United States. And I came to Frank Murphy, and Frank Murphy had written a famous dissent in Korematsu, where he condemned this internment as racist. And I started looking into him because I'd gone to law school. I went to UCLA Law School, and I hadn't, I'm sure we discussed the Korematsu case at some point, but it wasn't really sharp in my mind at the time. And I started looking into him and became intrigued with him because he seemed to be in a Forrest Gump type situation throughout the early 20th century, where he just seemed to be involved with a lot of important events in American history. And that brought us to the modern administrative state and the modern how we conceive of civil rights and how the government should operate. He was involved with a lot of that. He was the mayor of Detroit. He was the governor of Michigan, among other things. And he came up through the trial ranks of the Detroit community as well. So I became intrigued, and I basically wrote a book. I never ran out of steam on it. And 2 years later, I had a finished product about his life. And it was one of the most interesting and fulfilling things that I've done in my professional career. So that's a long answer, I think, to how I got to write a book on Frank Murphy.
I commend you for getting to the finish line and getting the book published. Many aspire, not all complete. So congratulations for that. And when you describe him as this Forrest Gump figure, I completely agree, because one of the questions I have here, and I think I'm actually going to ask it the way I wrote it down, which is, so is there any job this guy didn't have? It's an extraordinary professional biography, living a life that was intensely political and intensely legal. So that's something that I don't think we see in the same way today. And I wonder, if you could tell us a little bit more about, in addition to the positions that you've identified, the electoral positions that he held, a little bit more about his career and what's so distinctive about it as we think about it now in this century.
Yeah, so he became a Supreme Court justice, and I think one thing that was intriguing to me is that the Supreme Court justices today, whether they're on the left or right, they sort of follow a certain path to the Supreme Court, and it's sort of they go to a top school and then they clerk for on the Supreme Court, and they might do a few years in a big law firm, and they follow a certain path. None of them have really run um, big agencies in their past. None of them have been governors of states where they had to communicate with the people and to articulate their views in a way that ordinary people would understand. And Frank Murphy had that ability. He had to run for office, and he had to be able to appeal to a large group of people. He had to represent people he didn't necessarily agree with as well. And so he was a governor, and he got elected to a large state, Michigan and Detroit. Detroit was a much bigger city than it is today, both in number and also the country was smaller in population. So he ran the fourth largest city in the country at the time. It was the center of scientific management and the auto industry and everything else. And he had to deal with a lot of Republicans. He was a Democrat, but he had to deal with a lot of Republicans. It was basically a Republican state. And so he learned how to communicate with people. And they took that with him to the Supreme Court. And I think he had a very pragmatic view of how to deal with issues. We're taught to cite precedent as lawyers, and I'm talking mostly with lawyers or lawyers to be here. And it's very important to cite precedent. For him, not so much. I think his point of view was more what makes sense, and to try to get to the result in that way. So I don't think I made my lawyerly disclaimer, by the way, at the beginning, which is I do work for the government, and my opinions expressed here shouldn't be construed as the opinions of my employer. And I do try to be careful in that regard, and it's important that I be careful and separate the two.
Yes, thank you for putting that in here, and we'll include that in the introductory text to the podcast to make it clear that the conversation we're having, that you're talking to us in an individual capacity, and the views expressed here are your own and in no way reflect on those of the government or your employer. So thank you for including that here. There's sort of two tracks I want to pick up, or two threads I want to pick up from your last comment, which is, can we put some dates on, we don't have to do the whole, if you will, CV, yeah. But I guess when was he, the sequence from, if we could sketch it, mayor of Detroit, governor of Michigan, and then I think his last job with FDR when he was federal, when he was in Washington, was it attorney general before he was on the Supreme Court? Attorney
general, and people say that he may have failed up to the Supreme Court because he was very aggressive in going after Democratic Party bosses of various cities. And FDR was more of a pragmatist in that regard. He didn't necessarily want to rock the boat with some of the mayors, and Pendergast in Kansas City, for example, was famous for delivering more votes than there were people who could actually vote. They voted Democrat. So Murphy would go after these city bosses, and he would, and there's a thought that when the Supreme Court position opened up, they thought they would put him in there to get rid of him from the attorney general. But to answer your question, he was born in 1890 and grew up in a small town in Michigan, which it's called Harbor Beach now. It was Sand Beach at the time. And the federal government at the time didn't have a lot of interactions with small towns. But one thing that it did do was it built infrastructure relating to navigation and the waterways. That was one thing that the federal government did a lot of. And Harbor Beach was the beneficiary of a big, it's called Harbor Beach because the harbor was built there by the federal government back in the 1890s and earlier. And Frank Murphy would have seen the federal government and the power of the federal government doing something good. It brought a lot of benefits to his town. And the boats would come from Lake Superior down to Detroit. They had to sort of pass through Harbor Beach if you look at a map of Michigan and Lake Huron. So he would see a lot of boats passing by, and it's about 120 miles north of Detroit, as I think I said. And then he went to the University of Michigan, undergraduate and for law school. World War I broke out, and he decided to enlist in the Army. So he became a speaker. He was a great speaker wherever he went, and he was sent around during World War I throughout the Midwest to give basically propaganda speeches to buttress the American position in World War I. There wasn't universal support for joining the war at the time, and he sort of spread the word and met a lot of people and impressed a lot of people. So after World War I, he went into Detroit into practice and ran for a criminal court judge position. There's all sorts of things we could talk about in that regard as well, but I think the point is that he had to get elected there, and he started his electoral career in Detroit, became the mayor of Detroit at a time when the Depression was kicking in, 1929, 1930, and he saw people literally starving. There was no safety net as we associate it today with the federal government. People were starving on the street, and he felt it was his duty as the mayor to do something about that. And he ultimately concluded the only way out was to get the federal government involved. And he was a precursor in that way to the New Deal, and became an early ally of FDR as well. FDR gets elected in 1932, and he is appointed as the Governor General of the Philippines. So he does have a very diverse career. There's a thought that he, as a Catholic, he was being put into this position in order to appease Father Coughlin, who was very well known as a radio one-time ally of FDR and became an enemy of that, and anti-Semitic as well in his outlook, but at least he was a supporter of FDR to start off with. And Murphy was in the Philippines right when the Philippines was being set free from United States domination. So he oversaw that. It was a peaceful transition. And FDR brought him back to Michigan because he was concerned about winning in Michigan. It was a Republican state, as I said, and Murphy was actually a popular Democrat. He brought him back to help him be elected in 1936. Now he's governor of Michigan, and so as you can see, there's a lot here that he did even before he became a Supreme Court justice. One highlight of his governorship was the sit-down strikes that took place in Detroit and throughout Michigan. He was heavily involved with settling those and keeping labor and management from breaking out into armed violence. And I think that was a really important event in American history. That's where American history diverged from a lot of other countries. Labor and management. Yeah, you could make a lot of arguments that it didn't work out that well one way or the other, but at least they didn't turn into armed conflict and kill each other. And I think that was a real benefit of Murphy being involved with that. So this all happened before he became a Supreme Court justice during World War II.
Yeah. We're gonna come back to it. I'm sure. And then he was appointed to the court. Was it 1941, or was it after?
It was before, but 1941 is when he 1941 is right at the beginning of World War II, and he came in before that. When I say World War II, United States involvement in World War II is arguably much before that as well.
Yes. My apologies for glossing on the chronology. And
well, there are a lot of dates, and that is one of the challenges of of telling someone's life in a coherent way. When I wrote this book, there were different angles that I tried to take in writing it, and I just decided the chronological approach was the best way in the end.
Um, well, and so here I'll ask the question that tries to try and bridge what we've been talking about, which is the political career to the career on the court. And I guess there's a couple different pieces to the question, at least as I'm thinking it through. One is just generally being involved in electoral politics. How did that affect how Murphy did his job as a justice? And then there's a second piece to that, if you will, at least as I think of it, which I think is separate but certainly related, which is that he was a Democratic politician. And then one could even bring into that, perhaps, I'll let you decide, the religion, his religion, and whether, if that influenced how he did his job as a justice. And so, one of the things I think it's so interesting about biography, right, as we try to peel away and understand a life, how those experiences, how they may have influenced what kind of justice he was during his tenure on the court. So if you can treat that as a single question with several parts, I'll stop.
Yeah, no, these are all things that I struggled with, because an ethnic person on a court, or noticeably ethnic person on a court, or however you want to define that, and that's sometimes tricky, should they be bringing in their past into their decisions, or should they actually be going out of their way to not bring their background into their decisions? So I think, one contrast to Murphy, sort of, and it's not a perfect contrast, but I do mention in my book, Frankfurter, Felix Frankfurter and Murphy were two of the more, at the time, identified as ethnic Supreme Court justices, Murphy being Catholic and Felix Frankfurter being Jewish. And I do think that there was a difference in how they approached the law. I think Frankfurter tried to bring out in some of his decisions the fact that America we should promote public schools, for example, and public schools are a good way of uniting the various different people in our country. And there were a couple of Supreme Court cases where the two men diverged in terms of how they would approach it. One involved, there are a lot of cases, but two cases in particular after World War II. One involved whether public funds should be used for parochial school busing, and Felix Frankfurter thought it was Justice Frankfurter thought it was important to find that they shouldn't be used in that regard, and he really encouraged Frank Murphy to agree with him on that. And Frank Murphy was originally going to stay out of that case completely, because most of the parochial schools were Catholic at the time, and I think they still are. And he didn't want to be perceived as being influenced by the Pope or by his Catholic upbringing. And Frankfurter encouraged him to actually come in and say there should be no public funds used for parochial school buses. Frank Murphy actually did come in, but he found it's okay to use money in that regard. And the next year, the situation was, in a public school, could you use an empty room for sort of religious instruction if there was an empty room? And in that one, Murphy sort of turned around and said, no, you can't do it. And he agreed with Felix Frankfurter in that way. But the two men, I think, often were keenly aware of their ethnic backgrounds and their religious backgrounds, and they struggled with how to make them relevant in their decisions.
And it's interesting that you pair them or connect them on this one dimension, because otherwise, they're extraordinarily different.
Yep.
Frankfurter, coming from the most elite pedigree, or having the most elite pedigree that one could imagine, which was the Harvard Law School professor, and you know, the kind of person who, why he could be on the Supreme Court today because of you know, his extraordinary you know,
His connections
academic,
at
intellectual
Brandeis. Yep.
accomplishments. And so, but in other ways, of course, and that's of course very different from what you've told us about Justice Murphy and his background. Um, the the other, I mean, since you brought up Justice Frankfurter, I we corresponded a bit about this. FDR's appointments seem to fall into two categories. At least that's how I understand them. There's kind of what I would call, you know, the legends, of whom Frankfurter, I think, is one, and his first appointment, Hugo Black, uh, William O. Douglas, Robert Jackson. These are still justices. We still talk about them. There were, I think, were a number of biographies written in the last decade that, you know, went back and really told the story of these four justices as a group. And then you have, if I may, right, the other guys, the other appointments that FDR made.
Rutledge and Murphy, and yes.
And so did you think about that at all in terms of choosing Murphy as a subject? Because Murphy, candidly, isn't someone who we spend a lot of time talking about in law school today, as compared to some of the quote legends.
Yeah, and the thought is intriguing, and history is strange in that way. A lot of people are vindicated. Today, we would consider their views to be very modern, and there is the question of whether it's better to use the carrot or the stick to bring people along. So the example that I use was in Brown versus Board of Education, which overturned Jim Crow and separate but equal, and all the problems with that. The word racism is not used in Brown versus Board of, even though that's exactly what was happening. And there's no like browbeating of the South in Brown versus Board either. And Earl Warren was very, Justice Warren was very conscious in doing that. He wanted to bring all the justices along. He wanted to be a unanimous decision. And so to do that, he had to not state the obvious. And you can argue that that's the right approach, you know, to bring everybody along. Murphy did not survive that long. He died in 1949. I speculate on whether, if he survived, what he would have done in Brown versus Board of Education, whether he would have gone along with it in the way that it ultimately came down. Murphy used the word racism in describing the internments of the Japanese Americans in the United States, and it was the correct way to describe it, but was that the best word to use at the time in a country that was racist, where people don't like to be called necessarily racist when they are, and so at the time when he was like that, he developed a bad reputation. Now, does that mean historically he should have been forgotten? And my argument is no. You should be looking at people. Certainly look at the context of how they're making their decisions, but on the other hand, look at them, see if they were vindicated in how they described matters at the time. He was not remembered partly because he was known as a flamethrower at the time. He didn't go along with the majority. Even when he agreed with them, he would file a concurrence, and it would normally have language that was not accepted by the others. And he just developed this reputation as a Supreme Court justice. And all his accomplishments, by the way, because the Supreme Court was the last thing he was on, all his accomplishments along the way were swept aside, and his Supreme Court career sort of transcended all his other accomplishments at that point. So I think he was forgotten for that reason. There were some really good biographies on Murphy stretching into the 1980s. Nothing really after that. And Korematsu, he comes up in Korematsu as it's one of the great Supreme Court dissents. But other than that, he's really not acknowledged too much. And I think that's my argument is in the book is that he should be reassessed based on modern conceptions of justice. And he was really vindicated in a lot of ways.
And one of the things that, just as we're talking, and I think this may take us back to the question of the politician as a justice and the relationship between those two. I think it's fascinating that the Murphy, as you describe him as a politician, right, who had to bring opposing sides together or deal with people with whom he disagreed, and seems to have been fairly successful at it in a number of different contexts, that the irony is that on the court, he won't go along in some way.
Yeah.
That is, and do you have any, sense of why that was true for him? And just to sort of frame it, you were talking about Brown, and I think at least as I understand the conventional explanation is, oh, Earl Warren, Chief Justice, former governor, so concerned that in a case with the magnitude of Brown and the controversy attendant to it, that, as a quote, politician concerned about the court's institutional legitimacy, political legitimacy, that it's imperative that the decision be unanimous and that we must all stand together as a, unified, all the justices must stand together as a court, which is something that continued well past the 1950s, that idea in desegregation cases. And so, if that's an explanation for why Warren did what he did, which is to say, oh, well, he's a former governor, it plays out very differently for Murphy. Do you have any sense of why that's true?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good point, because I think when I say that Murphy was concerned about representing various groups on the court, here's where his Catholicism does come in, and his sense of religion. He definitely thought the Supreme Court was a place where the condemned can look for that final act of justice or redemption. And he had a conception that the court was there to look out for the despised and the people who aren't otherwise represented. And as a politician, that is consistent with how he was generally as a politician. It didn't really hurt him. He pontificated a lot as a politician and said, we have to help the poor. And I mentioned Detroit, where he saw it as his job as the mayor to, first of all, allocate money to feed the homeless and the starving, and to the detriment of everything else. And he, to the extent that he had to, he would criticize landowners and business people who weren't paying enough in taxes. It didn't hurt him as a politician. You would think that might hurt him, but he was able to, until he lost his re-election as governor, it never hurt him. He was taking the side sort of throughout his political career. And then FDR enabled him. He didn't have to appoint him as Attorney General after he lost at the Michigan governorship. There's another governor that I mentioned in my book who lost as well. There were the New Dealers, the quote unquote New Dealers, really lost in 1938 for a variety of reasons. And Murphy and various other governors lost as well. FDR didn't need to appoint him as Attorney General. He did it to send a signal that he was not done politically. Murphy was associated with a certain branch of the New Deal, and so he appointed him to show his critics that he still had some fire left in him. And Murphy was someone who who actually was promoted. He went for keeping his point of view. So I don't want to downplay. There were times when he dissented and filed concurrences. There were a lot of times that he was part of the majority, and he was part of the quote unquote New Deal majority that was upholding New Deal legislation, the alphabet soup of programs that FDR was putting into place, and he was at the forefront of incorporation, which again were law students and professors here. So it was the Hugo Black point of view, where you want to bring in the Bill of Rights into states, and that was a direct attack on the South. The South was really opposed to that, because obviously the federal government at the time was very progressive and was going to go after segregation and the failures in the South. So there was a North-South divide. Hugo Black, interestingly, was from Alabama, and he was a great friend of Murphy, who was from Michigan, as I said. Wiley Rutledge was from Kentucky, and the three of them, along with Douglas, formed 4 out of the 9. They were a pretty solid block in how they voted for the most part. And I was able, in reading the book, there was, in researching the book rather, I was able to find a lot of personal notes between Murphy, Rutledge, and Douglas, especially. The three of them had a very similar sense of humor, even though they came from different places. Murphy seemed to connect with everybody. He was Rutledge, again, Southerner, Hugo Black, Southerner. They all liked each other, and they respected each other, and they had fun with each other. So I think that was a secret to Murphy's success as well. He captivated Roosevelt. FDR enjoyed being around him as well, and they had a sort of earthy humor, and he didn't mind getting picked on, and he didn't mind how he was portrayed by the other. So he had, I don't want to understate, he was able to come to consensus a lot. It was just on certain points he went on his own and thought it was important to do that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because I realized as you were talking that you were sort of, I think correctly, you know, balancing out or responding to an implication or inference that my question may have suggested. So I appreciate that. I'm so intrigued by his personality. Is there anything more that you would want to say in describing him than what you've already said? Because I think one of the books about the FDR Supreme Court, is scorpions in a bottle.
The scorpions, yep.
And that's or the scorpions, and that's comes from that expression. And so that someone was able to navigate that is fascinating. Or are there other aspects of his personality that we haven't discussed so far? Or
well, let me say this, because this is my first book that I've written, and it is a biography, and one of the things you bring to a biography is your own experiences. So in trying to get to the essence of the man or the woman or whoever you're writing about, you soon come to the conclusion, at least this is my conclusion with Murphy, is that there's a lot of unknowns that we're never going to figure out why he went one way rather than the other way. And I might have a different context as I say that, but one example is right after World War I. He's comes back from World War I. He has all sorts of connections. He's already established himself as a very successful trial attorney. He's coming back to Detroit, which is this dynamic growing city at the time. And he had, and he could have gone into the business community, and he could have actually, at the time, the Republican Party was different than it is today. It had a big tent, and he could have joined the Republican Party and moved up the ranks as a politician, been pretty progressive as well. But he made this decision to become, to go into the U.S. Attorney's Office instead, and to take this course as a criminal court justice. Why did he do that exactly? Not clear. There might have been some overarching reason that he wanted to do that, or it might have just been that the U.S. Attorney's Office position was open for him at the moment, and he went in, and that set his course in that direction, rather than as a business attorney. He knew all the car company executives, including Walter Chrysler, the Walter Chrysler. He knew him very well. Chrysler offered him the general counsel position at Chrysler Corporation. He was the godfather of his either children or grandchildren. He was a godfather. He never married. We can mention that as well. He was a bachelor his entire life, and and that is an element of his background, which we could talk about as well. But why he went in certain directions is not entirely clear, but he had a very strong sense that he had to help people, and it was driven by his Catholicism to a certain degree. I don't think there's any question about that.
Can I just pause on that, which is like the idea of service and mission and concern for those less fortunate? Is that coming close, even though it's a sort of oversimplification and a shorthand when you mention his Catholicism?
Yeah, there was something called, and I'm not Catholic, so one of these interesting things was to bring myself up to speed, so there's a doctrine, a paper by the Pope, 1890s, called the Rerum Novarum, which basically was a response to, and I'm grossly simplifying this right now, but it was a response to the growth of communism in the urban areas of Europe. And the Pope, obviously, the Catholic communism is godless, and that was a source of friction between Catholics and the labor movement at times. But this was the Pope's response to that, and his attempt to give a Catholic gloss to helping the worker class in Europe. And Murphy and a lot of young Catholics were very taken by that. It influenced them greatly. Murphy was a practicing Catholic. He went to Mass whenever he could. When I was in Harbor Beach doing research, there's a Catholic church that was basically founded by his mother, more than his father, but and he every time he went back to Harbor Beach, he would go to Mass. He would mingle with the locals, and he would stay afterwards, and they discuss religion. When he was sworn in, to his various positions, he would have the Bible open to Isaiah, a section where you have to, in essence, help the poor and the oppressed, and that was very important to him. So yeah, he did have this underlying core value, but you can say that a lot about any religion. There's religion teaches X, but a lot of people in that religion might have opposite views. At a Passover table, there's going to be any number of political views expressed, and so that is an example of how people in the same faith could go in different directions. But yes, I agree with your sort of assessment of how he looked at his life and how he approached his politics and his judicial philosophy.
I think I have a ton of questions, but I think 3 that I think I'd like to get to in this discussion. The Bachelor piece that you just mentioned, and I feel like it would be incomplete, our discussion would be incomplete without giving you an opportunity to say a little bit more about that, and what you were able to make, what were you able to sort of sort out, and how you came to what you think about that aspect of the justice's private life.
Yeah, so I think about 20 to 25 years ago, it was important to articulate if there was a justice who was gay or had a different lifestyle. Um, it, and it's less important today, I think, because I think there's more of a tolerance in society. Not that we've gotten all the way there yet, but there's more of a tolerance, and there's less of a need to sort of point out this was the first person or this in this certain area. So about 20 to 25 years ago, the question was Frank Murphy the first gay justice on the Supreme Court? And I looked into this question a lot because my book might have become a bestseller if I had actually gotten the answer to that. But I had to conclude that I really didn't get the answer to that completely. He was a bachelor. There is a lot of evidence that he had a male companion for his entire life. The two men were generally in the same place. I mentioned his wanderings around the world, and Edward Kemp was generally with him every single time he moved to the Philippines, whether it was Washington or the Philippines or Detroit. He was there. He met him at the University of Michigan, and they were companions throughout their life. I wasn't able to answer the question. It would be irresponsible for me to conclude, in my opinion. Others, I think, would differ, but it would be irresponsible for me to conclude one way or the other. But the other question there is, what is the relevance? Like, what
Yes.
is it relevant at all? And it could be relevant, because if he was secretly one way and it's not and he couldn't articulate it, he might become a fan of the underdogs. He might back up underdogs generally. But you could also go the other way on that and say he would overcompensate and maybe be harsher. And there are all sorts of examples of that in politics, where someone is identified ultimately in one way, and they took the opposite tack. So I struggled with this question as I wrote my book, and I do think it's relevant to explore, first of all, because I'm trying to give a picture of his life, but also to try to figure out if it influences his point of view in some way, so that's a long-winded answer. I should also point out that terminology is tricky, and it's even changed within the last 10 years. I'm certain that a lot of the words that I use in the book 10 years from now, they're frankly not going to be the right words 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And I put a little disclaimer at the beginning of the book saying, I'm just doing my best here. And I think that people sometimes are persecuted just for trying to live their life. And I'm very conscious of that, and words do matter. But so I'm not even sure that this discussion to bring this back, I'm not sure this is even going to be a relevant discussion at all in 20 years, if it's going to matter to anybody 20 years from now, or it might be very important. I don't know.
Yeah, no, my way of thinking about this is, that language, both, at the time, that is to say, in the 1930s and 1940s, or even before that, language reflects not just culture generally, but how we think about certain concepts or ideas. To sort of put it in an abstract way, our understanding of what is public and private, and within those spheres of public and private, how we think about conduct or actions in those spheres. And of course, the way things were when Murphy was alive are very different, or were very different, from the way they were, say, the 25 years ago that you referred to in your answer, compared to now, compared to the future, when which you've already sort of preempted in the book. And so I sort of come back to the relevance question, which I think you've discussed, which is, but I think in some ways I want to make sure that is there anything more to say about, at least from what you could, find out about Murphy, to him at the time, whether it would have consciously been, quote, relevant or mattered to him? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and I think it, so I wasn't able to find anything, and it's interesting. There are books on code words that were used at the time, and those code words were used in association with Murphy, in newspaper articles, and just sort of conscious acts, describing him as stroking the hair of a young female that he's with. It's sort of going too far in describing two people out on the town. It's a certain detail there that maybe that was a signal at the time, but again, like anything else, or it might have just been what it was, that he was stroking her hair at an event. But there was signals. It certainly would have been danger and even fatal to him politically, and maybe his life as well, if it was a public matter. At the time that he was active in Washington, D.C., Congress was investigating gays and lesbians, and they were losing their jobs at the time that he was active, Supreme Court justice. So he would have had to be extremely discreet. And just circling back again, he was in the U.S. Attorney's Office during Prohibition. There were speakeasies, and he loved the nightlife. He loved going out, and so he would have learned the value of being discreet. He knew how to be discreet, which is also intriguing to think. He was able to separate his public life from his private life. He had enough resources to rent out suites in hotels. And there would always be 3 or 4 people staying with him. So he was able to hide that aspect of his life.
The second question I wanted to ask, I apologize if it seems like we're abruptly changing course, but I know we've talked about Korematsu and his dissent in Korematsu. Were there any other decisions that he wrote as a justice that you feel have been overlooked or are worth calling our attention to?
Yeah, he's written, how I would describe his cases are that they are modern, and so they don't strike us as being that out there, but at the time he was criticized for him. And I wrote in my book about the first case that he wrote as a Supreme Court justice. It dealt with strikers and picketers at a plant. These workers who were striking for higher wages, and typically the way the law worked was they were treated as trespassers. The police would come in and arrest them, and it wasn't a free speech type of issue that they're asserting their rights. Today, there's obviously the unions and collective bargaining and everything else that wasn't around at the time. And by writing decisions sort of upholding worker rights in that context, he's getting the ball rolling in that regard. So a decision like that wouldn't necessarily jump out at us today, because it just seems like, okay, yeah, we accept that picketers can be on picket lines in front of factories. So I think that's an example of a type of case. And as you go through sort of the New Deal cases, he is heavily involved with New Deal, upholding New Deal legislation. But he was accused of being a hack, sort of a Democratic hack. And there is a case as well, and I'm not describing the particular names of the cases. They're in the book, but I'm doing that partly because it's just a blizzard. It would just be a blizzard of names, but also I think the facts are important. So if he was a Democratic hack, he would have sort of gotten behind democratic machines. And there were parties that ran after World War II. Um, Sort of, the one was a progressive party. It was Wallace. He was a vice president of FDR, and he was basically opposed to the Cold War, and he wanted to reach out to the Soviet Union, and everybody was nuclearized, and he wanted to go in a certain direction. So he tried to get on the ballot in Illinois, and Illinois had a requirement that you needed a certain number of signatories in every single county in the state, no matter how big or small. So he couldn't get the signatures in all the counties. As a result, he couldn't get on the ballot in Illinois. That goes up to the Supreme Court because he had plenty of supporters in Illinois. It was just that he couldn't get signatures in the rural counties that were highly populated. And Murphy said he should have been on the ballot. He should have been able to run. And if that viewpoint had prevailed, I think we would have a different political system today. It wouldn't be necessarily the two-party system that we have today. It was so that's an example of where he ultimately failed and his viewpoint didn't come through. But it does belie the fact that it goes against the fact that he was somehow
not just a hack.
Party hack. Yeah.
Yeah, voting Democratic on the court. And then the last question I have, and because as we were talking, and you mentioned Justice Douglas, there's a view of Justice Douglas that as long as he was on the court, which was a very long time, I think he still holds the record for service on the court.
I think that's right. Yeah.
That ultimately he wasn't happy or very happy on the court, depending upon which of at what point Douglas you're referring to and Douglas's time on the court. I guess Murphy was on the court almost a decade.
9 years. Yep.
And do you think he was happy on the court as a justice?
So I think at that level, everybody has higher aspirations. And Douglas, and by the way, Douglas and Murphy were great friends, and they had a sense of humor which was a little bit troubling, which I describe in the book. I think they would get into a lot of trouble today with some of the things that they were doing, but at least their public face was that they were upset that this was the end of the line for them. They had higher aspirations. Murphy, I think his time had passed by the time he was put on the Supreme Court. He might have been appointed as a Secretary of War or Secretary of State, something like that. But I don't think he would have been considered for president. Now he was a Catholic as well, so that would have been an impediment to him. But as I described in the book, I don't think it would have been a deal breaker for the American people. But his time had passed. He did express the view that he wanted to do other things. At one point, he said that he wanted to, and he was serious about this. The Philippines were under Japanese control. He wanted to be put on assignment in the Philippines to be dropped behind enemy lines. And he was serious about this. He wrote to Marshall, and who's subsequently did the Marshall Plan, and he did join the Army in World War II. So he did want to serve in a combat role in World War II, and that also that contributed to the sense that he was a bit strange, and contributed to that overall perception.
Yeah. That's how old was he when he died? He would have been.
He was about 59. So,
yes,
and he was
and
he was declining in health for the last 2 to 3 years. As I wrote in the book, if he had lived another 10 years, if he lived to the age of 69 rather than 59, he would have been part of the Earl Warren Court, or maybe that would have been a different court
Uh-huh.
altogether, but he would have remained. It's not too much to think that he could have lived 10 more years. And it would have been very interesting to see how he would have navigated in the 1950s. Also, he tended again to uphold civil liberties, and the whole McCarthy era was just coming to the fore when he passed away. He was the subject of the Dyes Commission back in 1938, which is the forebearer of McCarthy's. It's the same committee in the House, and he was accused of being a communist or a communist dupe for settling the sit-down strikes in Michigan and helping the workers to establish collective bargaining and unions and everything else. So he knew the sting of that firsthand, and he didn't have a chance to be a Supreme Court justice during the McCarthy era.
Yeah, that in the book, I know that you do, if you will, like the sort of historical what if um, in some detail, and it's a really interesting thought experiment. Certainly, there was a liberal bloc that dissented on civil rights issues until Warren, until Chief Justice Warren becomes Chief Justice. And it seems likely, if he can hold other things equal, that he would have been part of that bloc. But as always, things were in flux in 1949. Things were in transition.
And when we talk about legacy, Warren is actually a really good example of that, because if you go back to the World War II era with the Japanese American internments, he was the California governor and the attorney general, and he was all for getting rid of Japanese Americans without any regard to their rights whatsoever. He used vile language, but he's remembered as Brown versus Board of Education Chief Justice, and rightly so. But Murphy is not remembered in the same way, even though he was generally on the right side throughout his entire career, including as we can look back on the Japanese American internments in World War II. He was on the right side of that, and as you go through his career, he's generally on the right side of history. His definition of racism during Korematsu, I think is a definition that we would embrace today. It's the same sort of definition that the way he looked at it is the way we look at it today. It was radical at the time, and you can make the argument that if he didn't use that word in the Supreme Court case, maybe we wouldn't have the same conception of racism today. So he moved the debate forward by using words like that, and so you can see where I'm coming down on using words like that sometimes, and even though they're not strictly legally relevant to the situation.
I think that's actually really a very apt place to end, because it's sort of, it mentions the dissent as well, the Korematsu dissent, which of course is quite significant, and also, of course, points to today, which is, I think, how in describing Murphy as modern. So I want to thank you, really, really thank you, Greg, for taking the time to talk with us about your book. And it's been a really, really interesting conversation for me. So again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.